Before her name became known around the world, Gwen Araujo was simply a teenager trying to live honestly in a place that did not always understand her. She was born Edward Araujo Jr.B. in 1985 in California, but from a young age she expressed that her true identity was female. As Gwen grew older, she began living openly as a transgender girl, choosing her own name and embracing the person she knew herself to be. For Gwen, this was not a phase or an act, it was survival. She wanted what most teenagers want: acceptance, friendship, love, and the chance to be herself without fear. Gwen's home life was complicated but loving. Her mother, Sylvia Guerrero, supported her and tried to protect her as best she could. Still, Gwen faced constant challenges outside the home. School could be cruel, and strangers often judged her harshly. Despite this, Gwen was described by friends as lively, expressive, and hopeful. She loved fashion, socializing, and dreaming about a future where she could live freely. Like many young people, she sought validation and connection, especially from peers who made her feel seen. In late 2002, Gwen began spending time with a group of young men in Newark, California. She met some of them through social circles common to teenagers' parties, hangouts, casual gatherings. To Gwen, these interactions felt normal. She believed she was forming friendships and possibly romantic connections, something deeply important to her sense of belonging. However, beneath the surface, these relationships were fragile and built on dangerous misunderstandings, prejudice, and secrecy. At the time, conversations around gender identity were far less visible than they are today. Transgender people often lived in fear of exposure, rejection, or violence. Gwen understood this reality, yet she also believed that honesty could lead to acceptance. She had shared parts of her identity with some people in her life, but not everyone she met knew her full story. This was not deception, it was self-protection in a world that frequently punished difference. On the evening of October 3, 2002, Gwen was invited to a gathering at a house in Newark. It was the kind of invitation she had received many times before, and nothing about it seemed especially alarming. Teenagers often gathered late at night to talk, drink, and escape boredom. Gwen prepared herself as she always did, choosing her clothes carefully and stepping out with the same hope she carried each day, that she would be accepted for who she was. As the night went on, the mood at the house began to shift. What started as a casual social gathering became tense. Conversations turned uncomfortable. Questions were asked. Suspicions were raised. Gwen found herself in a vulnerable position, surrounded by people she thought she could trust. In those moments, the safety she believed she had vanished, replaced by fear and confusion.
What followed that night would change countless lives forever. Gwen was subjected to cruelty rooted in ignorance and hatred. The violence she endured was not spontaneous, it was fueled by transphobia, peer pressure, and a desire by others to assert power through harm. This was not just a crime against one person, it was an attack on identity, dignity, and humanity itself. After Gwen was killed, attempts were made to conceal what had happened. Her body was abandoned, as if her life had no value. For days, her family had no answers. Her mother waited, hoping Gwen would come home, unaware that her daughter's life had already been taken. When the truth finally emerged, it sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. The discovery of Gwen's death marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice. Law enforcement launched an investigation, and the details that surfaced were deeply disturbing. As arrests were made, the case quickly drew media attention, not only because of the brutality involved, but because Gwen was a transgender teenager. Her identity became a central focus, forcing the public to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, violence, and how society treats those who are different. Gwen Araujo's story did not end with her death. In many ways, that was where it truly began. Her case sparked national conversations about transgender rights, hate crimes, and the failures of systems meant to protect vulnerable people. Laws were questioned, attitudes were challenged, and a young girl who only wanted to live authentically became a symbol of both tragedy and change. This first chapter is not just about the events leading up to Gwen's murder, it is about who she was as a person. A daughter, a friend, a teenager full of life and dreams. Understanding Gwen's life is essential to understanding the injustice of her death. To see her only as a victim is to miss the humanity that makes her story matter. The road to accountability and awareness would be long and difficult, but Gwen's name would not be forgotten. The investigation into Gwen Araujo's death unfolded slowly, marked by disturbing revelations that shocked both law enforcement and the wider public. After days of uncertainty, Gwen's disappearance was finally reported, and police began piecing together her last known movements. It did not take long for suspicion to fall on the group of young men she had been with on the night she vanished. What initially appeared to be a confusing missing person case soon revealed itself to be something far darker. As detectives questioned those present at the gathering, inconsistencies in their stories began to surface. Some details did not align, timelines shifted, and explanations felt rehearsed. Eventually, under pressure, the truth started to emerge. Gwen had been killed in that house, and what followed was a deliberate attempt to hide the crime. The realization that multiple people were involved either directly or by helping conceal what happened added another layer of horror to the case. When Gwen's body was discovered in a remote area of the Sierra Nevada foothills, the reality of her fate became undeniable. For her family, especially her mother, the confirmation was devastating. The hope that Gwen might still be alive was shattered, replaced by grief, anger, and an overwhelming need for justice. Sylvia Guerrero became not only a grieving parent but also a determined voice demanding accountability for what had been done to her daughter. As arrests were made, the case quickly attracted national attention. Media outlets began reporting on the details, and Gwen's identity as a transgender teenager became a focal point of public discussion. This attention was double-edged. On one hand, it brought visibility to a crime that might otherwise have been ignored. On the other, it exposed deeply ingrained prejudices. Some coverage sensationalized Gwen's gender identity, treating it as a controversy rather than a fundamental part of who she was. This framing sparked outrage among LGBTQ advocates, who argued that Gwen deserved to be recognized first and foremost as a human being whose life was stolen. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally charged. Multiple defendants were charged, each facing different levels of responsibility. As the case moved toward trial, defense strategies began to emerge that would later become some of the most controversial aspects of the entire process. One such strategy attempted to shift blame away from the accused by focusing on Gwen's gender identity, implying that the perpetrators had reacted in a moment of shock or panic. This approach, widely criticized, highlighted how deeply transphobia could influence not only individual actions but also courtroom arguments. For Gwen's family and supporters, the courtroom became a place of repeated pain. They were forced to listen as their daughter's life and identity were dissected in front of strangers. Every hearing reopened wounds, yet they remained present, determined to ensure Gwen was not erased or misrepresented. Activists rallied outside courtrooms, holding vigils and demonstrations, calling for respect, fairness, and justice. Gwen's case became a rallying point for broader discussions about hate crimes and legal protections for transgender people. The community response was divided. Many people expressed sympathy and outrage, while others revealed discomfort or ignorance about transgender issues. Schools, workplaces, and families across the country began having conversations that had long been avoided. Gwen's death forced society to confront the real consequences of prejudice not as an abstract concept, but as something that could cost a young person their life. As the trial progressed, the prosecution worked to establish responsibility and intent. Evidence presented painted a picture of escalating fear, anger, and group dynamics that spiraled out of control. Witness testimonies revealed how decisions were made collectively, how opportunities to stop the violence were ignored, and how, afterward, efforts were focused on self-protection rather than remorse. These details underscored a painful truth: Gwen's death was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by individuals who failed to see her humanity. For the LGBTQ community, Gwen's case was deeply personal. Many saw their own experiences reflected in her story: the fear of rejection, the risk of violence, the struggle to live authentically. Vigils were held in her memory across the country, turning grief into solidarity. Her name was spoken not only in courtrooms but also at rallies, conferences, and legislative hearings. Gwen Araujo became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. This chapter of the story is about confrontation, confronting prejudice, confronting legal systems, and confronting societal discomfort with difference. It is about the painful process of seeking justice in a world that often fails to protect those who are most at risk. As the trial moved closer to its conclusion, one question loomed over everything. Would the system truly deliver justice for Gwen, or would it fall short, leaving yet another marginalized victim without full accountability? The answer would shape not only the outcome of the case, but also the legacy Gwen Araujo would leave behind. The final chapter of Gwen Araujo's story unfolded not only in the courtroom, but in the hearts, laws, and conversations that followed her death. When the trials concluded, the outcomes were complex and, for many, deeply frustrating. Some of those responsible were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms, while others received lesser consequences. For Gwen's family, the verdicts brought a measure of accountability, but not closure. No sentence could restore what was taken, and no legal ruling could erase the suffering Gwen endured or the pain left behind. What lingered most powerfully after the trials was the way Gwen's identity had been treated throughout the process. The courtroom debates exposed a painful reality, that prejudice could still shape justice. The attempt to justify violence by focusing on Gwen's gender identity shocked many observers and galvanized activists. It became clear that Gwen's case was about more than one tragic night. It was about how society views transgender lives and whose humanity is fully recognized. In the years following the trials, Gwen's mother emerged as a strong and unwavering advocate. Sylvia Guerrero refused to let her daughter's story fade into silence. She spoke publicly, attended events, and worked with advocacy groups to ensure that Gwen would be remembered as a daughter and a girl who deserved dignity. Her grief transformed into purpose. Through her voice, Gwen's story continued to reach people who might otherwise never have confronted the realities faced by transgender youth. The impact of Gwen Araujo's case extended into the legal system itself. Public outrage and advocacy contributed to renewed discussions around hate crime laws and the so-called defenses that had been used to excuse violence against transgender individuals. Gwen's name became closely associated with efforts to challenge and eliminate legal strategies that relied on bias rather than accountability. Her story was cited in debates about fairness, equality, and the need for laws that protect all people, regardless of identity. Beyond legislation, Gwen's legacy lived on in education and awareness. Schools, community organizations, and LGBTQ+ groups began using her story as a teaching moment, an example of what can happen when ignorance and fear go unchallenged. Workshops, documentaries, and discussions highlighted Gwen not as a statistic, but as a real person whose life mattered. These efforts helped foster empathy and understanding, especially among younger generations who were learning about gender identity in a more open and informed way. For many transgender individuals, Gwen's story was both heartbreaking and validating. It confirmed fears they already lived with daily, but it also showed the power of visibility. Gwen's life and death forced conversations that could no longer be ignored. Her name was spoken alongside others who had suffered similar fates, creating a collective call for change. Candlelight vigils and memorials honored her memory, transforming grief into solidarity and resistance against hate. Media portrayals also began to shift over time. While early coverage often sensationalized aspects of Gwen's identity, later retellings became more respectful and nuanced. Journalists, filmmakers, and writers increasingly emphasized her humanity, her youth, her dreams, and her right to live freely. This evolution reflected a broader cultural change, one that Gwen's case had helped accelerate. Still, the pain endured by Gwen's family never fully faded. Anniversaries brought renewed sorrow and reminders of what could have been weighed heavily. Yet there was also pride in the fact that Gwen's life had sparked meaningful change. Her mother and supporters knew that while justice had been imperfect, Gwen's legacy was powerful. She had become a symbol of courage simply by being herself. Today, Gwen Araujo's story stands as a warning and a call to action. It warns of the consequences of unchecked prejudice and the dangers faced by those who dare to live authentically in an unaccepting world. At the same time, it calls on society to do better, to listen, to learn, and to protect those who are vulnerable. Gwen's life reminds us that acceptance is not abstract, it is something that can save lives. In remembering Gwen, we are asked to look beyond labels and see the person at the center of the story. A teenager with hopes, fears, and a desire to belong. Her death was a tragedy born of hatred, but her legacy is one of awareness, advocacy, and enduring impact. Gwen Araujo did not choose to become a symbol, yet her story continues to shape conversations about justice and equality. The final truth of Gwen's story is this: while her life was taken, her voice was not silenced. Through the changes inspired by her case and the lives touched by her memory, Gwen continues to speak, to demand compassion, to challenge injustice, and to remind the world that every life deserves respect.